Welcome, and thank you for joining us for our Leading and Learning event. I'm Naomi Amaha, and I'm the Director of Policy and Government Affairs for the Denver Foundation. Today is about reflecting on what happened this legislative session, on what bills passed, which didn't, and why. We will also discuss the arduous process of developing and approving our state's budget. We are joined by two members of the General Assembly who bring unique perspectives on the 2026 state legislative session and how they, as elected officials, have handled these challenges to meet the moment for their constituents and for all Coloradans. Our Leading and Learning event series is about coming together, learning from one another, and hopefully taking away insight and perspective. Now I'm going to take us through a few logistics before we jump into our program. You are welcome. First of all, I will share that this session will be recorded and guests will be muted for the duration of the presentation. You are welcome to submit questions via the Q&A function, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as we can in the allotted time that we have together. To ensure that everyone can fully engage with this event, closed captions are available. You can choose them by clicking the CC icon at the bottom of your screen. Now, before we begin the actual discussion, I do want to take some time to share a brief background on the Denver Foundation's why regarding why we take positions and engage in work to advance policy change. We as an organization believe that we have a responsibility to take bold steps to advance racial equity and drive meaningful systemic change to improve communities across Metro Denver. One of the ways that we do this is through our policy and advocacy efforts at the local, state, and federal levels. The Denver Foundation took numerous policy positions during the legislative session, including positions on legislation impacting economic opportunity, environment and climate, housing, the nonprofit sector, and youth well-being. We also engaged in legislation crafted to provide state solutions following federal actions and followed the development of our state's budget closely. Once we have our discussions on the outcomes of this legislative session, I will pose questions from the audience to our panelists. We look forward to a thoughtful conversation that will leave us all knowledgeable and hopeful for the future. Now I would like to introduce our speakers. First up is Senator Katie Wallace. Katie Wallace represents Senate District 17, which includes Longmont, Lafayette, and Erie. Raised in Lafayette and now living in Longmont, she focuses her legislative work on affordable housing, the environment, and workers' rights. Senator Wallace serves as the chair of the State Veterans and Military Affairs Committee and is also a member of the Judiciary Committee. Prior to her election to the Senate, she spent 13 years working in political organizing and policy roles, both in the Colorado State House and in Congress. Thank you for being here, Senator Wallace. And now I'd like to introduce Representative Rick Taggart. Rick Taggart represents House District 55 in Grand Junction. He currently serves as the House Minority Member on the Joint Budget Committee. Representative Taggart moved to Grand Junction in the early 1980s to lead Marmot Mountain Works as CEO, chairman, and co-owner. He later served as the Senior Vice President of International Business and for the Timberland Company and as CEO of Swiss Army Brands for 15 years. Since 2010, he has worked at Colorado Mesa University, both as a senior manager and business instructor. In addition to his legislative work, Representative Taggart has served on numerous community and economic development boards and previously served as the mayor and city council member for the city of Grand Junction. Thank you, Representative Taggart, for being here.
My pleasure.
Wonderful. All right, so I'm going to start us off with a fun question. Hopefully you'll think it's fun, and I will pose it first to Senator Wallace. If you had to explain this legislative session to a friend in just one word, what would you say and why? And I would love for each of you to speak in the context of bills that passed or didn't, budget development, or anything you think really speaks to the dynamics of this session.
Sure. Well, hi, Naomi. Thank you so much for having us today, and thanks to the Denver Foundation for hosting. It's wonderful to get to chat with you all about this legislative session. I would probably sum it up in one word by saying busy. It was my first full legislative session, so I was appointed about a year ago in March, which meant I came in halfway through a legislative session last time and had less opportunity to run bills and just was kind of thrown in and able to learn a little bit, but did less on my own and of my own volition. And this time I came in with all of my own titles, had a lot more of a runway, and so took on a lot more naturally, which was a great kind of progression because I got to learn through both of those. But I ended up being on 31 bills this year, and some of them were really, really big fights right up until the end. And so I felt like from the beginning of our 120 day session all the way to the end, it was busy and felt like really good fights to take on, but certainly was everything all at once.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Taggart.
Thank you, Naomi, and thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with the Denver Foundation. I would sum up the session as painful. And rather than talk about my bills, I did have 20 bills, of which 19 passed and have, for the most part, now been signed off of. But I talk about painful more as a joint budget committee member. We had to make cuts that were extremely painful. We can never forget that anytime we have to make a cut, in particular on the Medicaid side of things, it affects Colorado citizens. And there were many a day where I think people would say they would see one of us or all of us drop our heads at any given time because we're trying to shelter ourselves from the tears that were in our eyes. And it just, I've never had an experience like that. And that's why I would say it was painful.
Thank you so much for your candor, Representative Taggart. And I just want to thank both of you. I can't even imagine the challenges you all experience, and you, especially Representative Taggart, and leading those really tough conversations. I think that leads into a great segue for our next question, and I'll start with you, Representative Taggart, around what trade-offs do you think were the hardest for lawmakers this year? And that could be around legislation or in relation to the budget.
Thank you, Naomi. I think I take it back to the budget again because the trade-off was how do we control spending, especially given the fact that we started off with an over $1 billion deficit that we had to make up. And how do you do that while minimizing the impact on Colorado citizens? So you're constantly balancing that need to be fiscally responsible with at the same time never forgetting the empathy that you have for human beings and some of the trade-offs you're asking Colorado citizens to take.
Thank you for that, Representative. Senator Wallace, what do you feel were the biggest trade-offs and what was hard about them?
I also would say the budget, though I was less directly in its making in the way that Representative Taggart was. I think good policy frequently takes expenditures, right? And in this budget year, and with the structural budget issues that we are facing, and the restraints of restrictions of Tabor, we simply can't have a functioning state government, and that takes trade-offs. And Representative Taggart was much more in the thick of it than I was, but I too had those conversations with parents and caregivers, and separate conversations with teachers, and separate conversations with environmental advocates, and separate conversations with nonprofit leaders, all of whom are trying to do very difficult, very important work for our communities. And the restrictions of our budget mean that we can't assist them in that work. And those difficult conversations are, as Representative Taggart put it so well, they're heart-wrenching. And can be a hard place to find hope when, again, people are just trying to promote a lot of good in their communities and do a lot of good. So those are difficult trade-offs to make. I think, we did the best that we could and tried to take a little bit from everywhere. And the JBC is wonderful and for having gotten this work done, of trying to take a little bit from everywhere so no one suffers wholly alone.
Thank you for that. I'll pose the next question to you, Senator Wallace. And thinking about, there were so many topics and policy issues that were considered this session, some of which have built off of previous sessions, some around just emerging issues that our state is grappling with. So I'd love to hear from you first, and then Representative Taggart. What are the policy conversations do you think that our state will still be having over the next several years, especially with, changes to the legislature, with a lot of your peers terming out, as well as new statewide leaders, including a new governor?
I should go first on this one, right, Naomi?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, I think the budget is going to be an ongoing conversation. I hazard to say. I think the structural issues, I will just put it from my own perspective. I think that we need to reform Tabor. Colorado was a different state than it is a different state now than it was in 1992 when we originally passed Tabor. It was an amendment that came the same year as Amendment 2, which outlawed, gay marriage in our state, right? So we are in a very different place in our conversations. And I think that it's time that we look at what that amendment is doing. To me, it is an amendment that says that government can't do good and shouldn't grow at the rate that it needs to in order to serve its people. And we've seen that through the ways that, just as one example, the services of healthcare are growing at a much higher rate than the Tabor rate allows us to grow with. And that is why we are seeing the cuts that we have to those critical services to families. It is also the choices that we have made in what services we want to provide. I happen to think that those are worthwhile services that we as a state should be able to invest in. And that's why I would advocate for a structural change to Tabor that reflects the structural deficit that it has exacted on our state for my entire lifetime. So I would say the budget will certainly be an ongoing conversation and the debates around how we address that. The healthcare inflation costs, kind of regardless of what we do with Tabor and if we reform it, we are seeing a 10 to 11% inflation rate in Medicaid. How are we going to pay for those costs as well as all of the expanding and inflating costs of government services as a whole? I think AI will likely come back. It took us a lot of sessions to handle one very small component of AI, which is discrimination in key decisions. And it kind of blew up the building. We weren't great at it. That is one very small component of something that our world is having to grapple with. So I imagine that will come back up. And then for me, I serve on the Judiciary Committee and the State Affairs Committees. And so I think that elections will continue to come up, and I look forward to having those conversations. And then I think that the role of the criminal legal system in our communities and where it has failed to serve us and how it is failing our state budget will certainly be an ongoing topic for me as well.
Thank you. Those are, I think, such timely topics and speak to just the nuance in a lot of these issues. You can't get at every piece of it in one particular piece of legislation and over one budget cycle. Representative Taggart, what do you feel are those policy conversations that our state will continue to have over the next several years?
Well, Naomi, I think to have the policy conversation, you have to start with the groundwork of what we're going to be facing for next year.
Yeah.
We're still facing a very serious structural deficit. We are facing a situation that our forecasts for revenues are modest increases at best. And there are still, if we had our economists with us today, whether they come from legislative council or whether they come from the office of OSPB, we're still in a situation where the risk of recession is very close to 50%. And certainly the costs associated or the costs that our citizens are bearing right now when it comes to the price of gasoline in particular and oil and its impact on so many industries. The groundwork is at best shaky, and that worries me a great deal as we talk about policy. At the same time, in that groundwork, we have for 2 years now grappled with $1 billion deficit. The one-time funds that we have utilized in these past 2 years, I think last year, the one-time funds were in the neighborhood of $400 million. And this year, I'd venture to say they were probably more like $300 million. And keeping in mind, we also reduced our reserve by 2 full percentage points, which is another $350 million. Those one-time funds are gone. There will be nothing left on the reserve side of cash funds. They are completely gone. And so when I look at the policy conversations, I have to look at them no matter what department from the standpoint of what are the highest priorities. And we are going to need the help of not only every member of the legislature, but every executive of departments to make absolutely certain we're funding the priorities. And that at the same time, we're looking at other policies that are nice to have, but we just can't afford them right at this particular moment. That's not to say we can't come back to them at some point. And that's going to require a tremendous amount of collaboration between the department chairs, the General Assembly, and the JBC. And last but not least, we have to find a way to deliver our services, whether it be Medicaid services, whether it be services from on the personnel side, you pick which department. We have to do things more efficiently than we have been. I'll give you an example of that. I ran a bill with the Speaker of the House, Speaker McCluskey, that begins a task force to look at higher education and all the workforce development programs that we do across the state. And most people don't realize that those workforce development programs are spread across 7 different departments. Let me repeat that. 7 different departments. So just envision a parent that's trying to make a decision for their young student that's coming out of high school. How in heaven's name can they make a good decision? Now, those parents that know, and I came from one of those families, that know their children are all going on to 4-year schools, that's not a big deal. But for that parent that doesn't know what's going to fit best, having 7 different departments with internships, with transition education programs, with certificate programs, with job training and transition again. I don't know how they get there. And so I am really hoping that this will be a model through that task force to take a look at programs in this nature and consolidate them so that we have only one administrative group and that the dollars are getting to our citizens as compared to being tied up in administrative functions, and make it easier on parents and students to make a decision as to what's next. And as I said to the speaker, to me, this is just the beginning of something we need to do on major programs across the state. Think about where Medicaid is across 5 or 6 different departments. Is that the most efficient way to manage Medicaid? I don't think so. So it's going to need some clear lenses and some real commitment to how do we maximize the effect of programs on our citizens and minimize the inefficiency.
Thank you for that, Representative. I think you framed up well just one of the pieces that we'll have to grapple with as we think about, how do we make structural change to ensure that our state government can meet the needs of those it's intended to serve. And that's going to be a part of that conversation. So thank you for laying that out for us. I'm going to turn it over to you for a specific question. The work happens in Denver, but it is done to really address the needs of all Coloradans. And you, Representative, as someone who's deeply connected to the Western Slope, would love to hear your perspectives around what can be and is sometimes often overlooked in statewide conversations.
Well, there's several things that we face in rural Colorado. That is, it is sometimes hard for people to understand that don't come from the rural part of the state. First and foremost, agriculture is a huge part of our economy in rural Colorado and Western Colorado in particular. And all we have to, I only have to look slightly to my east to see some of the major peach orchards in this valley, as well as the wonderful vineyards and other products. And we have to be careful on a continuing basis that we aren't doing things that would create a bigger burden on our agricultural community such that they get out of the business. We do a lot of positive things like the conservation easements. Easement tax credits are so very important that farms and ranches and orchards stay in the family. But we can never lose sight of the fact that agriculture is critical to this state and it is really critical to Western Colorado. We also have to face, it is difficult for us to recruit talent to rural Colorado and Western Colorado, as opposed to the Front Range. It's difficult to recruit top professors, for instance, for our universities. It's difficult on the healthcare side of things, and I fought in the JBC to make absolutely certain our residence programs continue to be fully funded, because many of our residence programs take place in a place like Grand Junction. And if we can get them here to do their residency, we've got a much better chance of keeping them. On the healthcare side of things, and this is true across because there isn't as much competition, healthcare costs are always much higher in rural Colorado than they are on the Front Range. And when we're facing the fact that our incomes are lower than the incomes on the Front Range, paying a premium for healthcare is problematic. It is not unusual for rural Colorado that 40% of our population is enrolled in Medicaid as compared to the state standard of 20%. And last but not least, the amount of individuals that have either a certificate, have a 2-year degree, have a 4-year degree and beyond, our population, that's still in the mid-30s. Whereas as a state, we're over 50. I know the governor would like us to be at 65%, but we're in the 50s as a state as a whole, but in rural Colorado, we're in the mid-30s. And so I always worry, are we prepared for the 21st, the second half of the 21st century, and the skills that are going to be needed to grow and prosper? Or are we going to continue to see prolonged poverty in rural Colorado that is very problematic?
Your Representative, you touched on a lot there, and Senator Wallace would love to hear just your perspective. Are those issues ones that you grapple with in your Senate district? How do you also think about your role in serving your constituents, but also matters of others from very different parts of our state.
Sure. I mean, I think about this a fair amount, and I appreciate that we have representatives from the Western Slope, from the Eastern Plains, like Representative Taggart, who come with lots of experience and grounding in their community, as well as a lot of heart to serve from those particular areas. Certainly, we grapple with similar issues in the Northern Metro, where I am in East Boulder County. I wouldn't claim that it would be the same because it's not, it's certainly not, right? Where we saw, when we saw the premium tax credit be eliminated from the federal level, my district saw, I think on average, 110% increase in those premiums, which is already outrageous. But I believe, and you can correct me, Representative, but it was 300% on the Western Slope, right? It was right. So it's almost a tripling of the effect. My community is along the Front Range where there's a lot of different access to different healthcare clinics. So consolidation and closures do not affect us in the same way that they do in the rural communities who don't necessarily have access to core care. So I would say those issues certainly exist here, affect us in different ways. And then I do come from an agricultural community in Eastern Boulder County. I have parts of Weld in my district as well. But I would say that the ways that our communities have developed looked a little bit different too. But we certainly grapple with those issues here as well. I will just close by saying, because I want most of that reflection to be from Representative Taggart as he represents that area. I will just say, I think in a lot of issues, one that I was thinking about most recently is education and how my districts in my community are some of the best well funded in the state in terms of school districts and individual per pupil funding. That is not the same throughout the state. And so when I think about education funding, I think about kids in every zip code, not just in my community, right? Where we have voted for certain mill levies and property taxes and things like that that allow us to fund from the local level at a different rate. And so I put even more onus on the state level funding there for those rural communities. And that's just one example of where we really need to take off. We need to have on multiple roles in representing our individual communities, but also thinking about the impacts statewide of the laws we're passing.
Thank you so much for that, Senator Wallace. So budget has come up a lot with each of you, so I think we're going to try to dig a little bit deeper and first start with you, Representative Taggart. As a member of the JBC, you've touched a lot already on the difficult choices you all had to make, but would love to hear a little bit more about like what's a difficult budget reality you hope our audience takes away, and how did that show up in your work to develop and ultimately pass our state's budget?
Well, I think by far the most difficult, and we've touched on this already, is that Medicaid over the last 10 years has had an average growth rate per annum of just under 9%, 8.8 and some change. And this year, the initial budget that we looked at had the potential of a budget increase of almost 12%. I think it was actually a little over 12%. And we just, as you know, a combination Tabor growth is related to population growth and related to inflation. And so you have a little bit of a buffer when during these last 10 years when our population was growing at a very rapid pace, mostly incoming people, but now that has slowed, and one might say it's either even going the other direction now. Those two in combination are not anywhere near 8 to 12%. So we carved out about $330 million out of the Medicaid budget to balance this budget, which ended up being an increase of 3.7%, which is closer to to the combination of population growth and inflation, but is still higher somewhat. But the pain that, and I said this before, when you have to cut IDD programs and you have to cut pediatric behavioral therapy and you have to cut provider rates. The governor initially asked us and had in his balanced budget 3.6% on top of 1.6% that he had already reduced during the special, just before the special session. So that would have been a 5.2% decrease to our providers and a reduction to 85 in many codes, 85% of the Medicare rates. It is still painful to think of what issues we caused, in particular with the IDD and PBT communities. And I just hope we don't have to do that again. But that means we've got to get more efficient at what we do, because that's really painful to do.
Yes. And I will take a moment of personal privilege. Representative, as the sister of someone with special needs, I thank you so much for just your increased thoughtfulness, especially around the populations that most need those types of supports, and how that played into the tough decisions you all had to make. So thank you for that. Senator Wallace, you had to vote on the long bill and all of the bills to make the long bill happen. Like, how were you feeling around, grappling with the budget realities and, making the decisions that had to be made in order to adopt our state's budget?
Poorly. I mean, there's not really a way to talk about over $1 billion worth of cuts to key services without feeling those impacts. And as we've talked about, that runs, the conversations run a whole variety of different stakeholders and community members who are going to experience this very directly. I think one of the biggest standouts for me was folks who are providing care for their own children with disabilities and really complex care. The JBC was grappling with large percentages of Medicaid going to a small percentage of users who have the most medically complex care. And those are some of the most heartbreaking cases where families are really doing their best to make every dollar count and make ends meet and be able to care for their loved one and keep them in what is a better outcome, a setting with better health outcomes that is also less expensive to us, right? Keeping folks in community has better health outcomes and is less expensive to the state. And yet we can't extend this benefit in this way because of the budget crisis. So again, I'm in a place where I think that our state should be having a different conversation about Tabor and what it limits. It passed when I was a year old. I'm in the state legislature now. I think it's time for a refresher of where we want to be as a state and where we want to invest.
Thank you, Senator. I'm going to stay with you. I think a lot about you and Representative Taggart and others, where so much of your work experience and lived experience show up in how you are in the Capitol, how you show up on legislation. And would love to hear from you, Senator, what lessons from your organizing background influence how you do this work, especially when working with people with very different perspectives and viewpoints.
Yeah, I think coalition building, right? The lessons of organizing people from a multitude of different perspectives and bringing them together. In community, I certainly have taken away one, not to reinvent the wheel, right? So people are already doing a lot of great, the Denver Foundation is a perfect example of this, right? Of people are already doing, they have found each other. Y'all have found each other. You have found ways to make critical impact into community by centering voices of those impacted, right? And so I think not reinventing that wheel and trying to come up with a new coalition, but instead find the people where they are already doing that work. And that looks like all kinds of different things. Is it churches? Is it nonprofits? nonprofits? Is it the neighborhood group, right? Is it the activist group, right? There's all kinds of different folks already involved, and I think finding them where they are and engaging them in the work that you're trying to do, as well as hearing from them what might be impactful to them, right? Not always coming in with a solution is a great way to find the best solutions, of just saying, hey, this is the problem that we're having. What do you think would help? Great way to source legislation and create legislation that will have the long-term impact that you want, which is to be well implemented. So I would say that, and then certainly, again, the patience that comes with organizing. We certainly get farther when we come along together, but it can take time, and that's why policy is iterative. It's why it takes multiple sessions to have these conversations, because you can think I thought heading into session that there were a couple of bills that I had really well stakeholded, and then as soon as they're on bill paper and out there official, whole new sets of folks who would be impacted come forward. And that is a good thing that we want and we need at the state legislature to, again, make that policy that's going to have the best impact on the ground. So I love that. It also is why sometimes the best policy doesn't get done the first session.
Mm-hmm. Great point. Representative Taggart, given your roles as an executive and a local government leader, what lessons have you taken from your work that influences how you show up at the state capitol?
I think the word that comes to mind is balance. As a longtime CEO of both private corporations as well as public corporations, you're constantly balancing the needs of your stakeholders. And I deliberately use the term stakeholders because most people think that we as CEOs are only concerned about our shareholders, and we are. But we're balancing, trying to keep that stakeholder population satisfied, while at the same time understanding we have the stakeholders of our employees, that we want our employees to do well and to grow and to prosper. We want our vendors to be treated fairly, and that they can grow and develop and prosper. And last but not least, we need our customers to be more than satisfied with our services and our products. So as a CEO, and gosh, it's almost too many years to say how many years I was a CEO, but you learn to balance that. You can't let any one stakeholder group dominate the other stakeholders, or you have a real problem in your company. And for me, I'm always looking for that same balance in government. I'm always looking for how, when we have competing sets of concerns, how do we develop policy that meets all the stakeholders' needs to the best that we can, understanding there's going to have to be compromise along the way. I know that's a terrible term in today's politics, but the last I knew, we get things done in the middle. We don't get things done in the extreme. And finding an area of compromise where everybody's got to give some. Mm-hmm. You learn that from a business, as a business leader, that very seldom is there a perfect solution. That solution has to be viewed by all the stakeholders as reasonable.
Thank you for that, Senator. And yeah, I think for those of us that have done this work for a while, you spoke to a lot of things, especially the got to give a little to get something forward.
You do.
Okay, I'm going to ask you, Senator Wallace, a specific question around a particular bill. So House Bill 1274, bill title State Agency Payments to Grant Recipients. Would love to to share a little bit about what this bill aims to solve for, what motivated you to be a sponsor on this bill, and why does it matter right now for our nonprofits in the state of Colorado?
Great question. I love this bill. I'm so excited to be able to highlight it with you all and appreciate the collaborative work that went into us being able to get this done. So this legislation will make it so it's changed a little bit throughout the legislative process, but in the end, it will allow state agencies to opt into giving a certain amount of money depending on the needs of individual organizations upfront to nonprofits. So when you are granted or given a grant, you can have a certain amount of monies upfront rather than applying for reimbursement for all of it on the back end. For me, I led this legislation because I had heard from nonprofits, local nonprofits in Boulder County and Weld County, but also really around the state about the tight strings under which they already operated. And I mean, I had heard stories about, CEOs of nonprofits using their own, like going into debt on their own credit cards to pay basic like rent or things like that for their nonprofit just to float the 3 to 6 months or whatever it was taking for the state to reimburse. That process just feels really cumbersome. We know we're giving it to nonprofits. This legislation ensures robust oversight of those funds, right? Make sure they're used safely and well in the way that we know not many nonprofits are doing, while also helping them do that a little bit easier, a little bit faster. I think that this is the time for this legislation because one, I think that we had checks and oversights that already could have helped us be doing this long before this, but nonprofits are taking on, as we face $1.5 billion in cuts from the state, nonprofits are going to take on more work of caring for those who need it most in our communities. And we're not just seeing that from the state level. The federal government is also investing less in nonprofits. And making their grant processes more cumbersome as well. So, and inconsistent. So, as we see all of that, and as we see the need for nonprofits rise in our communities, we have to be able to help them more. This isn't more funding for you all. I'm sorry, I can't do that, but it is more accessible funding, and I hope that that can be helpful.
Thank you, Senator. We're so grateful to support that legislation and echo what you've shared about the why and why now. Representative Taggart, do you have any perspectives around, especially given your work with various nonprofit organizations in your district around, what this type of policy can do to support them at this time?
I do a lot of work with the nonprofits in this community, whether it be on the children's side of things or whether it's on the education side of things or healthcare. And I very much appreciated House Bill 1274, and I voted for House Bill 1274, which was unusual for my caucus, but I do that quite often. The area this year I had to compromise. I had run a couple bills over the last couple of years for after-school programs, and I almost lost them completely this year, but I found my colleagues on the JBC willing to compromise with me to at least fund them at 50%. And we just had to look at a lot of the grant funding for nonprofits and first make sure that they were equitable. And what I mean by that is we again get into that situation that some nonprofits can afford to have a grant writer on board and get a very significant share of a grants. We see that a lot in the grants, for instance, in K through 12. I think when we examined that last year and this year, $80 million worth of grants went to 90% or 80 to 90% went to 21 school districts. We have 174 school districts. And when 80 to 90% go to 21 of them, there's a problem. And so we just, we're going to be obviously dealing with a lack of funds, but B, I think we have to find a means over a period of time how to disperse these grants equitably, understanding that bigger nonprofits have a real advantage because they have grant writing in-house. And I don't want to slight those people, but how do I help that small nonprofit that just can't afford a grant writer? How do I get them to even put in an application? How do I make the application such that it's not a book? For goodness sake, some of the applications are 20 to 40 pages long. Folks are having a hard enough time, much less filling out a 20 to 40 page application. So we need to totally look at our grant side of things and make it more equitable.
Thank you for that perspective. And I think we'd be happy to be a part of that conversation and connect you to groups that we work with that would warrant some discussion around how do we address that issue. I'm going to ask one more question before we jump into our audience questions. And we'll start, we'll give you a break, Representative Taggart, start with Senator Wallace. What gives you optimism about Colorado right now?
I think the people of Colorado are persistently what give me hope. In the last several years, we've seen them enshrine the right to choice in the Constitution. We've seen that just last year, we saw that I've led the Healthy School Meals for All ballot referrals. We saw even in Weld County, it passed to tax the wealthy in order to feed every child in Colorado, regardless of their income or zip code, right? And so I think that we are marching forward as a state in with determination and with goodwill towards one another, right? And I think it's honestly very refreshing to be out of the building for a minute. I'm not sure how Representative Taggart feels, but I love getting to come home and not only connect directly with people again and remember why I do that work, but see the good that they do for each other, and that we can connect to as a state and help uplift and bring statewide or give better funding to or any other mechanism that we have to support the really good work that people do for each other. So that's what gives me optimism.
Thank you. Representative Taggart, what gives you optimism right now?
I think it's the word collaboration. And I probably see it more from a JBC perspective than necessarily the House floor, which sometimes can absolutely drive me completely Looney Tunes. But, as a bipartisan committee and with us all caring so deeply about not only the fiscal side of things, but the serving side of things, it is really refreshing to go in every day and know we can debate, discuss, even argue, but find a way to bring something to a conclusion to the betterment of our citizens. I'm hoping that someday will rub off in the House because we desperately need that.
You do.
I would, as you know, the chair this year was my friend Emily Sirota, and sometimes I'd be texting her when ridiculous things were going on the floor and say, we must have a JBC meeting coming up here in the next 10 minutes so we can get out of this nonsense. But, I do see people reaching across the aisle. I know I do. And trying to find solutions. And a lot of times it takes a crisis of some nature to get people to realize we've got to work together. And that gives me optimism because that's the way I like to work. I don't go to work in the legislature thinking I'm going to get my way. I know that I'm going to have to compromise, and I know I'm going to have to work with people across the aisle, as well as some of my far right crazies in my own party. So So I have optimism there. I'm hoping the election will bring even more people that really want to be a part of the solution and don't want to spend all their time on ideology that doesn't necessarily help us at all.
I think there's a lot of people that feel that way, and I think both of you in what you shared will give the people that attended today and others that will hear this hope and just a sense of like there really is efforts to collaborate and address the issues and not let partisanship be the thing that dictates what does or doesn't get approved by our legislature or addressed in our budget. So thank you both for that. Okay, we've got a couple questions from folks that have joined us today. Thank you for those that submitted these. Um, this first one is in relation to budget cuts, and it is when evaluating potential budget cuts, what were your top three guiding principles? So, Representative Taggart, if you'd like to start with you, and then Senator Wallace, would love to hear your thoughts as well.
Um, Boy, that is a good question. I'll throw out three ideas. I'm not sure I would want more time to say they're the top three.
Yeah.
Um, but number one is the program a need of our citizens or is it a want of our citizens? To me, that has to always be the highest priority. We cannot afford not to fulfill the needs. And if we have to give something up, it's the wants, the lesser priorities. Number two is there an alternative either through a nonprofit or from business to take our place if we're to step back? If there is, we should be discussing that. If there isn't, again, we're in a situation where we're the only provider that can fulfill that need, and we need to understand that there's nobody that can fill in behind us. I would think that's the top two in my mind. I can't think of a third right off the top of my head.
Those are great. Senator Wallace.
I agree. I think those are great because I think without looking, especially at the needs in particular, we get into that slippery slope of I think for me some of the balance has been where do we decrease cuts the least to services already being provided, and that's hard, right? But how do we roll back the least folks that are already getting things because it's hard to roll back benefits that have already been extended. And then those things can take further investment. Like if you look at infrastructure, building a road or building a passenger rail or building all of these other things take ongoing investment. So I think that those are big ones for me. And then I think one of the things I grapple with most and that I frequently pose to our lovely JBC members who take on so much of this work for all of us is how do we spend money in places where we know it's going to save us money in the long term. Like if we have no money to spend on things that we know will prevent future spending, it's just the worst cycle to be stuck in. And we see this in the criminal legal system all the time where we just don't invest in community resources that prevent crime and stop people from landing in prisons and jails earlier, right? We see that with education. We see it with healthcare. We can also think about this for the environment, right? When we don't invest in responses to the very real impacts of climate change that we face every day, we're never going to get ahead of it, right? If we don't invest in the things that are going to move us toward a more carbon neutral future, we're certainly not going to make it better. So I think kind of that grappling, and a lot of what I've heard from JBC members is do a pilot program that can prove that this can save us money and we can make a case for why it's worth it in the long term. And I'll give just one more example of this because the JBC helped fund it this year. The Youth Mental Health Corps is a part of Colorado's AmeriCorps program. I was an AmeriCorps member when I was 18. I moved to Los Angeles to do a year of service. It transformed who I was as a person, and I know I had very real impacts in the community I was serving. Very worth our investment, and it saves us, that kind of investment saves us money and in the people being served and the young people. And in the Youth Mental Health Corps case in Colorado, it's bolstering a workforce in a more affordable way that we desperately need. We don't have enough mental health care workers in our rural communities and in our suburban and urban communities. So I think the JBC for preserving that, and it's one of the biggest things that I grapple with of how do we invest in the things that are going to invest in our communities moving forward.
Thank you, Senator. So many good nuggets there. Okay, another question. I'll start with you, Senator Wallace. What issues do you anticipate taking center stage next session, and how can our community best support and advocate for them?
I think it'll be interesting to see now. Majority Leader Rodriguez who's from Denver, was the leader on AI, the one AI topic that blew up the whole building and dominated most of our AI conversations. And that bill has kind of been settled in a different way now, and so we are starting to see some opening into different versions of AI, whether that be data privacy or how AI is AI allowed to administer healthcare? Is it allowed to act as a therapist? How does it interact with children, right? All these different various aspects. So I think it will be interesting to see that as an ongoing conversation. I'm sure we'll see Flock come back and police surveillance as well. I think that those will be big. And then I'll just put a plug at, I'm the state affairs chair. I think that the ongoing interference in our elections will continue to be an issue. And I was very proud to lead our big elections bill this year. It was backed by a bipartisan group of county clerks. It's a great example of those folks in particular. Our county clerks are majority Republican in Colorado just by the nature of our counties. And they are wonderful public servants who just want to make sure our votes count. And they are doing so under a lot of trials and tribulations right now. And so I think for me, that will be a large part of my focus too, of how do we defend our elections? How do we ensure their continued transparency and fairness?
Thank you, Senator. Representative, what are the issues you think will be center stage next session? And how can people support them or get involved?
Well, certainly, I think Naomi, Medicaid is going to be again at the center of our discussions. As you may know, we ran a JBC bill to form a Medicaid commission, which is made up of the six of us on the JBC and two members of the House and two members of the Senate. And when we were crafting that, one of the things that I said several times is we'll never have an opportunity like this again to really evaluate what we're doing right and what desperately needs to be improved upon within Medicaid for a variety of reasons. One, as you know, our longtime executive director, Kim Bimseffer, stepped down. Two, we have a new governor coming in at the beginning of next year. And this is an opportunity where we, as a group of legislators, with a lot of input from stakeholders, can craft some major policy ideas and changes that could prioritize what programs are most essential, that could make things more efficient, and that can cut out the waste that's caused by either abuse or just out and out fraud. And there's been enough press on those latter two to know that we know we have some of that. And how do we get to the bottom of that? But I truly believe we'll be meeting at least once a month. So I'm going to be making that commute a lot, which I do anyway, over these next 6 months. Well, it won't be 6 months because 1st of November we're due back as a JBC. But to be working on that, the very first meeting we're going to, I hope, identify the facilitator that'll help us in these discussions. I know I have some ideas of who could be great there. Certainly, if you folks have ideas, we would welcome those. I mean, it has to go through that standard RFP process, but still, I think we can find a very, very good facilitator. But I think that's going to be first and foremost because we're also facing the reality that come October of next year, the provider rate starts dropping at 0.5% a year, and the government match drops from 90% to 80%. So we're looking at situations 2 and 3 years out where there's going to be $1 billion shortfall in the Chase enterprise, which we've got to figure out. So I don't know any other way to say that Medicaid is going to be right at the top of the list again next year until we can figure these things out.
And that's okay. I think that's a reality we all need to accept. Well, we are just at time. I sincerely want to thank you, Senator Katie Wallace and Representative Rick Taggart. I was looking at my clock. We're not even 2 weeks from Sine Die. It would hit that in a couple hours. So the fact that you all were able to show up so fully after just a challenging legislative session, we are so thankful for your time today and your perspective. I want to thank our guests for joining. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question, but we will share them with our speakers today and see how we can facilitate some answers for you all. Look out for an event survey and a ways to engage email coming soon. And there will be a link as well if you want to sign up for our policy newsletter. It's pretty great. And it's a great way for you to see not only the issues that the foundation's engaging on, but other timely policy issues. And, if you got a lot of this event and support the work that we're doing at the foundation, please consider supporting our Civic Fabric Fund, which is really the space where we provide grants to nonprofits that are doing this amazing work to advance policy change. So thank you again to our speakers and everyone for joining, and I hope you all have a good rest of your day and rest of your week.